I'm going to speak now for maybe about 10-15 minutes on this topic. And I thought I'd start by, I guess, considering how a lot of us might have felt when we saw the response to Sarah Everard's death. I mean, I remember seeing the hashtag, "she was just walking home," trending online, and it was absolutely heartbreaking. It was a real shock, I think, to see just so many women speak out about their experiences of gender-based violence, because it's really something that we don't speak about very much. And I think the more I read, the more I realized that I shouldn't have been as shocked by the numbers. According to a crime survey for England and Wales done this year, 1 in 5 women between the ages of 16 and 24 have experienced some form of sexual violence, and 1 in 14 women have been raped or experienced sexual assault by penetration. The Susie Lamplugh Trust, which runs a helpline for victims of stalking, estimates that nearly 1.5 million people are affected by it every year. And that number, despite not even being able to leave the house, has risen by 40% since lockdown. Sarah Everard's death wasn't an isolated incident, but a massive wake-up call for the world to the reality in which women exist. Now, I don't think personally that I know even one woman who would say that she feels happy and safe walking home alone at night. I think most of us, whether or not we have a first-hand experience of gender-based violence, will either have some sort of self-enforced curfew, or we'll take some extra steps. You know, we might stay on the phone to a friend. We might hold our keys in our hands just in case. Or maybe we'll just hold our breath and pray that that shadow that's walking behind you doesn't follow you when you cross the road. There is something really deeply wrong, and we all feel it. Now, the government's response is a commitment to installing better street lighting and CCTV systems, as well as an increased undercover policing at bars. And while I'm personally grateful that they are listening and they're trying, I'm just not sure it'll be enough. I don't think I'll feel much safer. And after hearing the interviews tonight, I'm really not convinced that it's even going to be able to scratch the surface. The problem just runs much deeper than extra lights can fix. So what does the Bible say into this issue? What does it teach us about why gender-based violence exists? And what hope does it actually give us? We're going to look together in a minute at some bits from the Bible. And we'll see firstly how violence is a symptom of a world with no king, and then how Jesus is that king that brings us a different way. So let's dive in together. The first thing we're going to think about is how violence against women is a symptom of a world with no king. So we're going to read in a minute the last paragraph from the book of Judges. Now, the book as a whole is a real catalogue of how spiritual and moral decline go hand in hand, and how that is particularly underlined by the abuse of women. Before I begin, though, I want to say that thankfully, the Bible doesn't gloss over uncomfortable truths, but faces them head on, which means that some of what I'm about to speak on is quite graphic and hard-hitting. So please do be prepared for that as we get into it. And I really do mean that it is explicit. Now, before we read, I'm going to give us a bit of a backstory so that we can understand what's going on. At that time in history, the people of Israel were separated into 12 different tribes, and one of the tribes was called the Benjaminites. Now, a few chapters back, they took a man's wife, and they raped her, and abused her, and killed her. Her body is chopped up limb by limb, and sent to the leaders of the rest of the tribes as a sort of provocation. They want to fight, and they get it. Now, the leaders are upset, and they bring war against the Benjaminites, but leave some of the men alive. Now, all of the rest of the people of Israel, they swear not to give their daughters to the men in marriage. But for some reason, I think not wanting the Benjaminite tribe to die out, they make a plan so that these men that are left alive can have wives. So I'm going to read the passage now, and it's in our chat if you want to read along with me. This is Judges 21, verses 20 to 25. And these are the people, the leaders of Israel, they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, "Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh," these are women that are celebrating a religious festival, "if they come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers or their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, grant them graciously to us, because we did not take each man for them his wife in battle, neither did you give them to them, else you would now be guilty." And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives, according to their number, from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and rebuilt towns, and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. And they went out from there, every man to his inheritance. Now, this text and others in the end of Judges, these are some of the favorite texts of a man called Richard Dawkins. He's written a book called The God Delusion. He's quite a famous atheist. And he says that these verses are like kind of the proof that the Bible is misogynistic. And I think you can possibly make a case for it until this last verse in verse 25, which says this: "In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." These are difficult verses. It's like some sort of war crime you'd hear on the news. The leaders of the people are so morally corrupt that they endorse the kidnapping of women into a sort of sexual slavery. And what's almost worse is that the fathers and the brothers of the women fail to do their job too. They don't protect their daughters. They just let them be taken because of some sort of legal loophole. And they're nowhere to be seen. We'll see later why this is such a failure. But at this point, we're thinking, why is this in the Bible? You know, what is going on? And that last verse, verse 25, explains why. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You see, God doesn't approve or endorse violence against women. It's actually the opposite. This verse shows us that moral chaos and autonomy are the mark of a society that lack a righteous king. Now, I don't mean that they lack a royal family, but they have no ultimate ruler. And it doesn't mean that they lack a government either, because they do have a type of government like we do. But these are the leaders of the 12 tribes, and they're the people who are actually responsible for those women being taken. What they don't have is a godly leader who will judge rightly and defend the poor and the oppressed, someone to guide and teach God's law. And without this kind of king, we live in this sort of jungle where everyone just does what they want. And what ends up happening is a kind of survival of the fittest mentality, where the strong can take what they want when they want it, and the vulnerable are left unprotected and unspoken for. In our passage, we see a world where the grey-haired men in boardrooms make the decisions, and the women on the ground are the ones that pay the price. And while I'm thankful that our government in the UK isn't like the ones in Israel at that time, I would be naive to say that we're completely different now. You know, the stats that I read earlier show us the same sort of picture, don't they? The physically strong can still take what they want when they want it, despite a government that opposes it. Human government and laws just aren't enough, because the problem we face runs much deeper than that. What we need is a king that can actually change our hearts and bring us a different way. And thankfully, God has given us a king that will do that. So this is the second thing we're going to think about now, how Jesus is exactly the king we need to bring us another way. In the accounts of Jesus' life, there's never any question, actually, that the authors believe that he is the king. They call him the Messiah or the Son of God, all names given in the Old Testament that pointed towards God's promised king. But maybe what's more surprising for us now is how he himself treated women. One of the gospel accounts we have is written by a man called John, one of Jesus' disciples and an eyewitness to the events recorded. In John's account of Jesus' life, we're given a story where Jesus is alone with a woman by a well, and she's a Samaritan, someone who we learn from the Bible is ostracized from God's people. Not only that, but we're given details of how she's probably been treated terribly by men. She's had 5 husbands who have taken what they wanted from her and then left. And by the time we meet her, she's with a man who won't even commit to her in marriage. She's someone that, a typical king wouldn't even want to be seen with. But Jesus cares for her. He's alone with her, but acts honorably. And rather than taking advantage of her, he teaches her about the hope of eternal life that he brings. And then for the first time in this gospel account, he confirms his identity to her, a woman, that he is the Messiah, the promised king. He gives that privilege of knowledge first and foremost to a woman. And this isn't a one-off thing. Throughout the accounts of Jesus' life, we see again and again how he honors women, teaching them, caring for them, and being around them as friends, even with the prostitutes, the most outcast and marginalized in society at that time. And his love of women, and actually of all people, comes to a climax at the cross. Just earlier this month, many people celebrated Easter. And what is it about Easter that's worth being celebrated? Well, in the Easter story, we see the king, Jesus, the king not only of the Jews, but of the whole world, strung up on a wooden cross and die. Instead of a scepter, in his hands are nails. And instead of a crown of gold, he wears one of thorns. He dies willingly because he loves us. And he knows the problems of our world better than we do. He's died to be the solution. On the cross, he took on himself every wrongdoing of his people and faced death in our place. This isn't a woman needlessly dying, but Jesus dying in place of us all. In that moment, he gave us his perfect life instead. And that makes us able to do 2 things. Makes us able to reject the selfish things that are right in our eyes, and makes it able to follow him instead into eternal life. A life where there is no tears or death or any reason to be afraid. Not only did Jesus give himself up for his people, but he commands men who trust in him to do the same for their wives. And it's not just married women who benefit from this. The church is then a community where men as a whole are encouraged to honor women like Jesus did. And when that's done right, there's a real natural culture of care and safety for women to exist in. Now, it goes without saying that no church on this earth does that perfectly. And to see it as a whole, we need to wait for the day that Steph spoke about earlier, the day where Jesus' kingdom will be fully and perfectly established, with every brokenhearted given a crown of beauty instead of ashes, joy instead of mourning, and praise instead of despair. Jesus is the King we need, because he alone can change us from the inside, fully in eternal life, and give us a small glimpse of that now. So I began by speaking about my reaction to the news of Sarah Everard's death. I think for me, against the tragedy of the world that we live in, the hope that Jesus holds out shines even more brightly. And even though I can feel the effects of a world with no earthly king, because of what Jesus has done and is doing, I can honestly say that I can look forward with a sure and certain hope. And that really does change everything. I will still hold my breath and grab the keys in my pocket when I see a shadow walking behind me, because I know what kind of world we're in now. But I know that the day will come where I will never have to do that again.